Welcome back. We are now joined by Mike Adams, the editor of NaturalNews.com. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the top health stories of 2012. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David. Good to be here with you. Good to be back.
Thanks. Now, Mike, let's talk a little bit about the top stories. One of the top stories that we talked about this year, one of the top health stories, was healthcare workers fired for failing to get flu vaccinations.
Yeah.
And that's obviously, that happened in Cincinnati. A Cincinnati-based health system reportedly fired about 150 people because they wouldn't get their vaccines. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is all part of the mandatory, what I call gunpoint medicine. Now, they didn't go to these healthcare workers and actually shove guns in their faces, but what they did is they threatened them economically to say, well, if you don't get this shot, even though scientifically it's not effective, it's really not effective. The flu shot does not prevent the flu. It actually creates increased susceptibility to the flu in the following flu season. But because the propaganda of the flu shot industry is so powerful, and because they actually want people to be dependent on the shots and not to have a self-sustaining immune system, they have to mandate these things. So they threaten. It is essentially an economic sanction threat to say, if you don't get this shot, you're not going to get a paycheck. Now, the next step from that, which has been done in Maryland, by the way, is to say to parents, if you don't give your children this shot, we're going to line you up with guard dogs and men with guns, and we're going to march you through this building and forcefully vaccinate all your children, or you're going to jail. That already happened. That's not some weird dystopian future. That's like 2 years ago, I think, or 3, that actually happened. Right. So it's on. You know, part of what's happening in America today is they want to take away our firearms, you know, Second Amendment under attack, and also our free speech, First Amendment under attack, so that they can then force us to take all their medications. Vaccines are just the top layer of it. What they really want, David, is for all of us to be injected not just with vaccines, which have the cancer viruses in them, so that they can have a cancer industry that is profitable because of that. They also want us to be on their psychiatric medications. In fact, I think that's another one of the big stories of the year, so we'll probably get to that later.
Right, no problem. Yeah, and you definitely see also in legislatures, I think New Jersey drafted a bill, a legislator, saying that it's going to be harder for parents to opt out of flu vaccinations for their kids at schools. It seems that these legislatures are just saying, you know, you can't say thanks but no thanks. You got to give us a reason we deem is valid.
This is medical tyranny, and this is why Benjamin Rush and the Rush Amendment should have been enacted into the Bill of Rights. If we ever get a chance to rethink the Bill of Rights, we have to put in a medical freedom right, because it's so crucial. It's one of the basic human freedoms, basic civil liberties, or human rights, you might even say. But at the time, in, 1789 through 91, when the Bill of Rights was being heavily discussed and negotiated, the idea that you wouldn't have the choice to say no to a medical treatment was considered so bizarre that they thought, well, that will never happen. People will never be forced by a doctor to take a medicine they don't want. But, you know, fast forward 220 plus years, and sure enough, parents have been arrested for not giving their teenage child deadly chemotherapy. They've been arrested for it. Parents have been threatened with jail time for not giving their kids flu shots. And it's going to get worse. It's going to get much worse. Parents have their children taken away from them at birth if they refuse vaccine shots in the hospital for the newborn. So the medical tyranny is upon us. And it's only going to get worse. The more rights we lose, especially if we lose our Second Amendment rights, then we are going to exist as defenseless victims in a medical dictatorship, police state society. That's where it's really headed, David. And you know, thank God InfoWars is here to be the most powerful voice of truth in resistance to that kind of tyranny. And that's why I enjoy, you know, contributing and being part of InfoWars as well.
Yeah, not only are they making our kids take bad things, but it works in reverse. For example, in New York City, Mayor Michael Bloomberg is saying you first have to breastfeed your child, and they're not going to have milk in the hospitals. They're basically saying unless you cannot produce breast milk, you know, that's the only way you're going to get milk. So it kind of works in reverse also.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, we always want to encourage mothers to breastfeed, but the control freak liberals like Bloomberg always go about it the wrong way. They want to be a tyrannical dictator who orders you to do these things. So rather than educate moms, which could easily be done by just using their propaganda airtime to actually do something good, to say breastfeeding is good, breastfeeding is healthy, breastfeeding boosts the immune function of the child, and even reduces risk of breast cancer in the mom. But instead of saying that, they use their airtime to just conduct more tyranny schemes and to mandate that you do everything. So the philosophy of the control freak tyrants like Feinstein and Schumer and Cuomo and Bloomberg and Obama is that you're too stupid to decide anything for yourself. You're a stupid slave. And the state is the only thing that's intelligent enough to dictate to you what decisions you should make at every level: economic, health, food, diet, recycling, you know, trash handling, and certainly on issues like firearms. But, of course, these people are delusional. They're deranged. They are probably vaccine damaged, actually. I think Feinstein is a victim of intense vaccine damage. I think half her brain has been eaten away by the very thing that we are trying to save people from, which is mandatory vaccines.
Okay, let's talk about another top story that occurred in 2012. Merck vaccine fraud exposed by two Merck virologist. Basically, it says that the company faked mumps vaccine efficiency results for over a decade. There's a lawsuit going on right now. Tell us a little bit about this.
This is huge news, but it hasn't been covered by the mainstream media. And so, yes, two Merck virologist employees were required to fake the efficacy tests of the vaccine by Merck. And you got to understand, the FDA has given Merck a monopoly on certain vaccines, such as whooping cough vaccines, for example. But in order to maintain that monopoly, they have to prove to the FDA that they have a very high efficacy rate, which I believe is 95%. And by the way, these vaccines are nothing near 95%. They're probably not even 1% effective. So the level of fraud here is huge, is massive. But these virologists went public and filed documents with the federal government certifying what they saw, which was that the blood samples would be taken from patients in the clinical trial. And what they're looking for is antibodies to the vaccine viral fragments, right? And then they say that proves that the vaccine works because the patient is generating the antibodies. And so they're looking for antibodies. Well, they didn't find enough. So what they did is they gave the vaccines to animals. They took the blood of the animals, they extracted the antibodies from the animals, and then they spiked the human clinical trial blood with the animal antibodies to raise the antibody numbers. And then they turned that over to the FDA and said, see, the vaccines work. That's the level of fraud that we're talking about here. It is criminal fraud. And it shows that the vaccines that are mandated for us to take are so worthless and so scientifically fraudulent and based on such complete quackery that they actually have to commit criminal fraud just to keep the FDA approval. That should be the biggest story of the year in medicine. And it was one of our biggest stories at Natural News, but the mainstream media won't cover it.
Wow, that's amazing. Anything else on this story before we move on to another story?
Well, it's just indicative, I should say, of what's going on in every company. Those whistleblowers were from Merck, but in truth, virtually every major pharmaceutical company operating today has already been found guilty of felony crimes, and they've pled guilty to felony crimes. GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, in 2012 pled guilty to multiple felony crimes and paid the highest fine that had ever been paid by any drug company in the history of medicine, and admitted to fraud and admitted, David, to bribing doctors. They ran a physician bribery network of 49,000 physicians. It's a mob, all right? It's a criminal mob. And these physicians would receive kickbacks for prescribing their drugs. 49,000 doctors. And the kickbacks were in the form of so-called speaking fees. So if you prescribed enough drugs for GlaxoSmithKline, The drug company tracks how many prescriptions you're writing. And then if you prescribe enough, then they give you a kickback by offering you a speaking fee, which can be $1,000 an hour to speak to as few as 5 people. So they would gather together 5 people, throw you in front of them for 5 hours, pay you $5,000, which is really a bribe, and call it a speaking engagement, and those 5 people might even just be asleep. So that's how bribery is done today in Big Pharma.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to another headline. Basically, the headline reads, help me pronounce this.
Thimerosal.
Thimerosal in vaccines. Pediatricians basically want to keep this, keep this in the vaccines.
Well, let's just be blunt about it. The conventional pediatricians in America have sold out to the vaccine industry. They have sacrificed the lives and health of countless children for their own power and their own profit. It's not surprising, given that other groups do that as well. But the pediatricians are very dangerous. If you're a parent out there, in my view, in almost no circumstance should you take your child to a pediatrician. Because if the pediatrician diagnoses your child, let's say, with cancer, which can be diagnosed, quote, diagnosed with an X-ray, without any second opinion, they can demand that you start immediately poisoning your child with chemotherapy, even without a second opinion. If you say no, they will often call the police. And they will call CPS to come out and take your children away and to have you arrested for not following their recommendation to poison your child with chemotherapy, which is a synthetic, deadly cocktail of chemicals derived from the mustard gas chemical weapons of World War I. That's where it comes from. That's why it causes your hair to fall out and people to vomit and lose all their muscle mass. And it causes brain damage and kidney damage and liver damage. There's a phenomenon called chemo brain in those who get chemotherapy. Even if they survive the chemotherapy, and many don't, and it's said that they died of cancer, they actually died from chemo most of the time. But if they survive, their IQ is lowered, literally. They have signs of dementia and Alzheimer's. They cannot function the way they used to because they have chemo brain. And this, of course, works in favor of the cancer industry, because the lower your IQ is, the more easily you are manipulated by oncologists who are pushing another round of chemo, because the #1 side effect of chemotherapy is cancer. Now, I know I'm off track from the thimerosal topic.
No.
But getting back to that, so thimerosal contains methyl mercury. And let me just say on the record here that any scientist, doctor, pediatrician who says that we should inject our children with methyl mercury directly into the bloodstream should be arrested and tried as a criminal. There is no such thing as any safe dose of mercury to be injected into your body. No such thing. It is a crime. It should be a crime to do so. It probably is a crime. It's just not being enforced. Vaccines contain not only methyl mercury. We did a story at Natural News that cited the CDC documents showing that vaccines also contain aluminum, a metal that causes Alzheimer's disease, MSG, monosodium glutamate, an excitotoxin that kills brain cells, that it also contains mercury, and in addition, the vaccines contain formaldehyde, which is the brain pickling chemical that's used, to preserve tissue. Yeah. But it actually kills the tissue, and then it keeps it from decomposing because nothing biologically is happening. So you've got 4 major poisons in vaccines today. All 4 of those poisons, which again are aluminum, MSG, formaldehyde, and thimerosal, methyl mercury. Those 4 poisons, all of them are neurological poisons. These are added to the vaccine by the vaccine criminals to say that they make the vaccines work better. What they really do is they cause more brain damage, and they create a lobotomized population that is incapable of resisting tyranny.
Let me play devil's advocate. Oh, come on, Mike. Maybe you've got us here. Maybe these vaccines are bad, but there's got to be some vaccines out there that are good. The industry can't all be bad. What do you say to those people?
Well, there is an argument for something called clean vaccines. If you could have what's called a single-dose vaccine for a legitimate disease that is a high-risk disease. Let's say you're a government worker working in a level 4 biohazard facility, and you're dealing with, let's say, Ebola. Well, it's a very dangerous, deadly biohazard. If you could get a clean vaccine with no mercury, no aluminum, no MSG, and so on, taking that vaccine, if it did produce antibodies against Ebola, would have a higher reward-risk ratio. So there is a case for a clean vaccine against specific workers in specific high-risk situations. But that logic falls apart when you start talking about a flu vaccine that contains 4 toxic, neurologically damaging substances to be given to the entire population for a so-called disease, you know, the flu, that healthy people can overcome on their own anyway. And in fact, you need to overcome that to practice to exercise your immune system. And what children really need is vitamin D, not vaccines. If you have high levels of vitamin D, you're going to be immune to virtually every cold and flu that comes along circulating in the wild.
So most vaccines are bad?
Nearly all vaccines are deadly. And even the children that they don't kill, they damage them, they brain damage them. It is a kind of small lobotomy is what's going on. And then if you combine that with the other chemicals that are coming in through personal care products, which have the artificial fragrance chemicals, and the pollutants in the air from glues and formaldehydes that are in particle board furniture, for example, or carpet. And then you combine that with the fluoride that you're getting from the water supply, and then you combine that with the chemtrail chemicals, you know, aluminum salt and barium salts and so on that you might be inhaling or getting through food. It is the total burden that becomes a toxic cocktail, which explains why autism rates have skyrocketed, cancer rates in young children have skyrocketed, why we have more cases of liver disease and kidney disease and dialysis. Dialysis is a huge booming industry because kidney failure is widespread. And vaccines are the #1 cause of kidney failure. The medical industry won't tell you that, but it's true.
Okay, we're going to move on to another story. Any last comment on this?
No, I mean, we could almost do a whole show on that issue, but I think we hit some of the big points on it.
Okay, yeah, people definitely want to pick your brain on each of these stories. That's why I ask. All right, let's move on to another story. The headline read, is one of your stories, every human emotion now classified as a mental disorder in new psychiatric manual DSM-5. I said, joking around before the show, I hope they classify liberalism and neoconservatism also as mental disorders. What's your take on this?
Well, this comes out of the negotiations for the new DSM-5, which hasn't been released yet. We're currently on the DSM-4. And the DSM-5 will come out sometime in 2013. But you got to understand, the DSM-5 is the billing Bible for the psychiatric industry. It is, in other words, if a so-called disorder makes it into the DSM, then they can bill Medicare and Medicaid for treating that disorder. So in order to maximize their revenues, the psychiatrists sit around in rooms, much like this one, and they vote into existence fictional disorders that they make up. And they give them fascinating, bizarre names like general anxiety disorder.
Yeah, I got a kick out of this one, obedience defiance disorder.
Yeah, ODD.
It used to be a nice smack across the head would take care of that, but...
Well, by the way, you and I both apparently have obedience defiance disorder because we are able to think for ourselves. So any person who questions, let's say, the government explanation of 9/11 or the government explanation of Oklahoma City, or even you question your doctor saying chemotherapy is good for you, and you say, well, I don't think it is because it's kind of toxic, you immediately can be diagnosed by a psychiatrist with obedience defiance disorder. Then you can be treated with psychiatric drugs, chemicals, mind-altering drugs sold at very high markups by the pharmaceutical industry, and they, of course, cause additional brain damage. And many of those drugs are actually linked to violent behavior, homicidal tendencies, and they've been linked to nearly every school shooter that we've seen in the past 20 years in America. So we have, it's just like fraud upon fraud. There are so many layers of deception in this. But the bottom line is that psychiatrists, they want to classify every human experience as a disease or a disorder. And the only way to be free of disease in their view, is to be dead, because a dead person exhibits no behavior. Thus, they cannot be diagnosed with a behavioral disorder. But if you're not dead, then you're diseased, according to them. And their goal is to put every man, woman, and child in America on a battery of mind-altering psychiatric drugs. And they have accomplished much of that goal, and it's only going to get worse if we don't put a stop to it.
I'm going to play devil's advocate again.
Yeah, please.
Okay, Mike, sure. I mean, yeah, people misdiagnose all the time, but attention deficit disorder, that's for real, and there are real diagnoses out there. What do you say to that?
There is absolutely no scientific test whatsoever that can diagnose attention deficit disorder. There's no brain scan, there's no blood tests, there's no biology. If there's a real disease, it should be detectable, right? But instead, for ADD, what happens is a psychiatrist sits in a room with a child, observes the child for 5 minutes and says, attention deficit disorder, just slaps a label on them. Now, you might say, well, maybe their behavior is erratic. Maybe they're climbing the curtains. Maybe they're running around. Well, look at their diet. If they've been eating artificial colors, F, D, and C, red number 2, and yellow and blue, many of these dyes are derived from petroleum byproducts, and some of them have aluminum even. These are the culprit typically. Nutritional deficiencies, not having enough trace minerals and good nutrients, and too much intake of the toxic food additives and food coloring chemicals and food preservatives. This is what, and sugar, just refined sugar, can drive kids crazy. You know, drink a cola. It's got phosphoric acid in it, which damages the kidneys. If it's got aspartame in it, that damages the brain. Or if it's got corn syrup in it, that comes from genetically modified corn, and it's a liquid sugar, like high-octane hyperfuel for a kid, plus the caffeine. So the behavior that's being observed by the psychiatrist mostly is a result of poor dietary choices and poor parenting, not a disease or a disorder. Now, you might ask, in anticipation of this, if you're still playing devil's advocate, you might say, well, wait a minute, there was a study that showed that children who have ADHD do have smaller brains. There was a bunch of brain scans that indicated that. The answer is that's because they were all put on Ritalin, and Ritalin causes stunted brain growth.
Wow.
So there is scientific evidence that if you're put on these drugs, you will have stunted growth and stunted brain development. There is no evidence that there is any, quote, disorder that has any biological truth to it whatsoever. The entire industry is based on complete fabricated fiction.
And one last point on this this story about the psychiatric manual. In your article, the last gentleman, Alan Francis, who chaired DSM-4, he said that he now admits it was a huge mistake that has resulted in the mass overdiagnosis of people who are actually quite normal. He says, quote, inadvertently contributed to 3 false epidemics: attention deficit disorder, autism, and childhood bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
It is astonishing that he is admitting that he and his colleagues created 3 false epidemics. But you just read his quote. That's his quote. He admits his mistake. Most of his colleagues are not willing to admit that mistake because the racket is too lucrative. As long as they can convince people that these disorders are real, then they can continue to play doctor. I mean, because let's get this straight. They're playing doctor. It's no different than, you know, a couple of 5-year-old kids running around playing doctor with a little doctor toy set. These psychiatrists are playing doctor. They even call themselves doctors. These people are more insane than the people they're diagnosing as having disorders. What we really need to do, if we want to look for mental defects, we need to look at the psychiatrists themselves. A very large percentage of those probably literally need to be removed from society and put in mental hospitals because they're so detached from reality, and they're such a danger to our children.
One more thing, and then we'll move on to another story. I do want to play devil's advocate on this, because even though it's just a small amount of people that have this condition, just as a person walking around, I have seen people with severe depression, or, you know, they call it bipolar disorder. What do you say when you see someone who's severely depressed, and you could tell that there's something more than just he's having a bad day or a bad week?
Yeah. Well, you got to look at the food-mood connection. If you look at people who describe themselves as feeling depressed, first of all, the experience of feeling sad or feeling down is a normal human emotion as part of the cycle of human experience.
But these people are like continuously, like from Monsanto.
I understand, yeah, and we'll get to that. But the psychiatrists say that any fleeting expression of sadness is a disorder. So if let's say they take a young kid, a 13-year-old young boy who lives in a small town and he grew up with his best friend, and then his best friend moves away, and then he's sad. Well, you're supposed to be sad when your best friend moves away. That's not a disease. That is life. That's a normal human experience. So he doesn't need medication. What he just needs is good support, and maybe to find new friends, maybe to find a hobby, maybe to have good parenting to support him in this transition. But now you said, what if someone is chronically depressed? Most of the time, this is due to malnutrition. And it's interesting that one of the drugs that's given for mental disorders is lithium. Did you know lithium is a trace mineral element? It's a nutrient. Lithium helps heal the brain. You don't have to get it from Big Pharma. You can get it in a trace mineral supplement. Lithium is already in there. So you often hear of lithium preventing people from going crazy, you know, in mental wards. It does the same thing even before you get to the mental ward. If you have lithium, if you have magnesium, if you have zinc and selenium, and all of these other trace minerals, plus you need to be free from the toxic heavy metals. Now, there are some people in society who are truly mad because of the toxicity of the metals they've been exposed to. For example, there are towns in America that are near copper mines. And because of the copper mining activity, there is a very high level of copper in the local water supply and possibly even in the soils because of it falling out of the air. Towns that live near copper mines have very high rates of psychosis. A lot of people don't know that. Towns that are near coal-fired power plants have more mercury falling out of the sky, out of the power plants onto the farms, especially if you look at the way the trade winds blow. People who eat that food tend to have more early onset dementia and Alzheimer's because of the mercury. So if you look at people who are truly crazy, I mean, like, you know, blabbering mad on the streets, almost always they have, one is toxic heavy metals poisoning, and number two, severe deficiencies of the healthy trace minerals and other nutrients. Can drugs help those people in some cases? At best, they can suppress symptoms and create the appearance that that person is less mad, but the drugs don't heal anybody.
Okay.
So sorry to go into such detail. But
no, don't worry about it. I mean, each story is like fascinating. You could literally, like you said earlier, just dedicate a segment to each of these stories.
Yeah.
We've got a couple more, so let's get to it. Another top health story.
Well, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but no. If you look at why is America going mad, part of the answer, I think, is because the chemtrails are dropping aluminum onto all the crops. So we are eating ourselves into a state of insanity if we eat crops that are grown with those metals. So I think, you know how the Roman Empire, some people believe that the madness that took over and led to the fall of Rome part of the reason for that might have been the lead that was in the aqueducts. So all the water that came into Rome from over the mountains and through the aqueducts, all that water was then inundated with lead. And as the citizens drank the lead, they became insane.
Wow. So,
you know, a heavy metal may have brought down the Roman Empire, or at least been a factor. Well, metals may be bringing down the American Empire. This is actually the big story, man. If you look at these deranged liberals who think that, for example, a gun-free zone sign magically stops guns, that is delusional thinking. That is deranged thinking. That is psychosis. But that is commonplace. What could explain a common psychosis across the liberal-minded population? And why is Dianne Feinstein so insane that she would think that you have to give up your guns even though she has a concealed carry? It's because I believe part of the answer is that we are suffering widespread metals damage to the American people. I think we're living in a brain-damaged population.
Yeah, that's why Alex has had guests like Gerald Salente, who says we're dealing with sociopaths. Yes. And people giggle at that like that's some, you know, a line just for entertainment. Maybe it is. No, I really believe some of these leaders are sociopaths.
Yeah, they're brain damaged. I think that what we're seeing is a lot of even politicians, U.S. senators, some of them, and members of the House. I think that they are victims of vaccine damage and of heavy metals damage. And they don't realize that. They are insane. I think everybody would agree Joe Biden is insane. And probably Obama would even agree. He's a nut job, right? Why? But why is he a nut job? If you dissected his brain, you know, post-mortem one day when he passes away, and you dissect Joe Biden's brain with a microscope, because it's probably pretty small at this point, but you'd probably find very high levels of mercury in Joe Biden's brain.
Yeah.
Maybe we should put a sign on Joe Biden's forehead that says mercury-free zone.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah.
All right, another story. Senator pushes for GMO labeling in Washington. Now, this is piggybacking. Well, we'll just do this first. Prop 37. What happened a couple of months ago was they voted down GMO labeling in California. It looked like it was going to pass. We don't know if there was voter fraud. I don't know. There probably was. Let's first talk about Prop 37's defeat as part of the year in review, and then we'll talk about how there's still hope because the state of Washington is spearheading a new initiative. Let's talk about Prop 37.
Well, by the way, I got to thank you for doing this whole segment because I want to post this too. I was thinking about filming sort of the year in review, and I never got around to it, but here I am. We're getting it done. It's great. Yeah. So Prop 37 had support of 2-to-1 leading up to the election. But then in the election, the electoral results, the election results said that it failed by 5 million votes. I don't believe that to be the case. I think there was vote counting fraud at work there. And in fact, the reporter who's done the best work on that so far is John Rappaport. You know, nomorefakenews.com, and you know he's been a contributor to InfoWars as well as NaturalNews. John has looked at it in great detail and found that there is a statistical anomaly in the counting that could not be possible. You know, 1,000,000 to 1 odds against it, that indicate that all of the later votes just suddenly came in against it. And if you look at it geographically, it doesn't make sense either. So I believe there was vote fraud with Prop 37, no question about it, because we know those companies that were opposed to it, Monsanto, DuPont, you know, all the big biotech companies, we know that they played a lot of games before. You know, like suing farmers when their seeds blow into his field and he inadvertently grows corn contaminated with their genetic technology, they sue the farmer.
Wow.
It'd be like, you know, spilling oil in someone's yard and then suing them for stealing your oil. I mean, it's
crazy.
It's insane. But again, it gets back to the psychosis. You know, are the Monsanto operatives, are they insane? Are they suffering from true heavy metals psychosis? Maybe so.
Yeah, I mean, Prop 37 was up by at least 5% come Election Day. And then it lost. It was pretty shocking.
I don't think the voters voted it down. I think it was fraud.
Well, let's talk. I know a lot of patriots were saying, geez, I'm so disappointed because as California goes, so goes the nation in terms of statewide initiatives. And a lot of people were saying, well, there's nothing else on the horizon. And then we found out that Washington State is going to put together a referendum, or they're working on it, to try to get GMO labeling passed. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't actually know much about that because it's still pretty early in the situation. I do know that Washington was going to be, either Washington or Oregon were going to be the next states to take this up. The question with this is, whatever fraud was carried out in California, can it then be replicated in Washington State? And I believe the answer is potentially yes. I think that this team of fraudsters can, you know, work their fraud anywhere in the country. And what we really need, I believe, is a nationwide, you know, like, for example, if Obama wanted to actually do something good with his power in his last term and invoke executive orders which I'm completely against because that power obviously shouldn't rest in the executive branch of government. But if he wanted to do something good with an executive order, why wouldn't Obama just issue an executive order to say there is now GMO labeling required nationwide? He could do that. Why wouldn't he just say, you know, small amounts of marijuana are no longer illegal nationwide? Mm-hmm. He could do that. But instead, he uses his executive orders to do things like legalize secret arrests and the torture of American citizens and secret kill lists and assassinations. And that shows his true character.
Yeah, that's why I find it humorous when liberals say, well, Congress is stopping him. Really? Congress stopped him from doing the NDAA? Congress stopped him from throwing people in prison for smoking marijuana? That's all him. He could stop that today.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. He could stop the mass psychiatric drugging of children. He could even stop the silly gun-free zone signs from being placed on schools and actually put armed guards in the schools, which he should probably even love that because it makes it more of a police state. Mm-hmm. You know, so why aren't they in favor of that? But the truth is, you know, Obama is an evil, wicked person who is also a puppet for the globalists, and he is using his position of power to commit atrocious, really, violations of everything that America stands for, to gut our economy, to destroy our freedoms, to leave Americans misinformed and misguided on every issue that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yep, there you go, Washington. And it turns out it's a bill that's being drafted in Washington.
Good. Well, we will definitely cover that when it becomes an actionable item.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a county that's in Washington that is GMO-free. There's a county in Washington that already requires GMO labeling.
Good.
Now, on to another story. We talked about it earlier in the newscast I did. It's by Aaron Dykes. He wrote an article just a couple days ago. Lapdog FDA approves GM salmon for human consumption. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, this is the Franken salmon that they've developed. It's twice as large as regular salmon. It's genetically modified. And there's always been pressure from these companies, from the biotech industry, to get the FDA to approve it. So the FDA approved that, I believe it was on New Year's Eve, or right around that time when no one was really looking. And remember, last year, Obama signed the NDAA on, I mean Christmas Eve. Did I say New Year's Eve?
You said New Year's Eve.
I'm sorry.
But it's always in the dark. It's always in the dark that these people sign these.
It's always in the dark. But last year, Obama signed on New Year's Eve the NDAA. So this year, the FDA, I think on Christmas Eve, approved GM salmon. Well, okay. But the problem is that just like with GMOs, you have the issue of genetic pollution. What if those genes begin to spread and combine with other varieties of corn and create a crop vulnerability that cannot be anticipated by scientists? You could have a nationwide crop failure leading to mass starvation and the destruction of the greatest asset of modern humankind, which is the seed. Without seeds, we cease to exist. So now with salmon, they're going to breed these salmon in locations where they could escape. And then they could breed with wild salmon, creating a vulnerability in nature that could cause salmon to be wiped out. So this is not just about what you're eating and the poison that's in the corn, or where the GM salmon, how it's grown. It's also a question of the threat to the global ecosystem through genetic pollution. These biotech industries turning food into a weapon on two separate fronts. It's a weapon to poison people. It's also a weapon to destroy the environment, to destroy the seeds that sustain human civilization. That's why GMOs are such a heinous crime against humanity. And if we had any sense at all, we would have, the government should be marching in there and shutting down the entire biotech industry, literally at gunpoint. That would be an appropriate use of government force. But instead, they're using the guns to force mothers to vaccinate their children, which is highly inappropriate use.
And they're saying that the salmon could become extinct if this continues?
Well, yeah, sure. That's the threat, that you could lose salmon stocks throughout the world. We already have a collapse of fisheries, ocean fisheries around the world. The ocean ecosystem is in a state of collapse right now. We have ocean acidification that is destroying coral. You know, the coral reefs are made out of, well, calcium and other minerals, and they depend on a certain pH level in the ocean water in order to maintain their structure. As the ocean water becomes more acidic, the coral begins to dissolve, and then you begin to lose entire ecosystems. The overfishing is also collapsing large populations of shrimp and, you know, all kinds of edible ocean fish that we harvest and consume. Those populations are collapsing due to overfishing. Mm-hmm. So we are rapidly moving into a time when the human race is going to face mass starvation. It could be a GM corn crop failure. It could be a sudden collapse of ocean populations or the ocean ecosystem. It could be something unforeseen that is unleashed by these mad scientists. But stocking up on food storage is a wise thing, because mass starvation is in our future.
Wow, it's pretty grim. Now for our final story. This is not, you know, drum roll please. This is not the number. This is not the #1 story. These are all top stories of the year. But this was my, I don't want to say favorite story, but the story that I remember the most in terms of health, and that's a study, a GMO study, that said that rats fed a lifetime of GMO corn grew horrifying tumors, and there's actually images of this, and a 70% of females die early.
Oh yeah, there they are.
But GMO corn is great, according to the authorities.
Yeah, if you love to grow these amazing tumors, and I believe the research showed that those tumors grow with 300% more frequency in the rats. And by the way, those rats that are being shown to you right now, most of them died prematurely of the cancer tumors.
Wow.
So when we look at cancer rates in the human population today, you have to look at the connection between the consumption of genetically modified corn and the aggressive cancers that we're seeing in the human population. But the system, the racket, is clever in the sense that they know if they can feed you foods that cause cancer, the biotech industry, then the pharmaceutical industry can make money treating the cancer with toxic chemicals that cause more cancer that result in more treatment. So it is a cycle of death and profit. As long as they keep you diseased and misinformed, which is the whole point of the mainstream media, they can keep you trapped in a cycle of death that Dr. Gabriel Cousens calls the culture of death. And the culture of death includes things like psychiatric drugs and the school shootings and the massacres that we've seen there, but it begins with food and how the food has become poison. So, we shouldn't be surprised, David, that we live in such bizarre times, because when the food is poison, when the news only broadcasts lies, when logic and reason have been banished from social media like Facebook, you are only going to get insanity. Feinstein, Schumer, Obama, cult leader Obama. These are the signs of our times: psychosis, delusion, death, and corporate profit.
Yeah, and for those that say, oh, we're just health extremists, in many European countries, they don't allow GMO, right? They don't allow.
Oh, right. GMOs are banned in many nations around the world, including China, by the way. One of the least free nations in the world, at least, has the sense to not poison its own people. So, but no, these labels, someone says, well, you're an extremist or you're a conspiracy theorist. It's laughable now, because the cancers are here, the autism rates have skyrocketed, the death is all around us, people are dying, everybody knows somebody who's dying of cancer. Mm-hmm. The mass poisoning we are inundated with it. And Feinstein is saying, yeah, we're coming to take your guns. That was called a conspiracy theory just a couple of weeks ago. If you said, oh, they're coming for our guns, you were called a wingnut or a conspiracy theorist. Now it's a fact.
Yeah, and God forbid there's another false flag attack. Then we're really in trouble with terms of the guns. But we don't want to, you know, I don't want to get off course. But
well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I believe that as that Feinstein proposal comes up for a vote in the Senate, they will stage another attack or bombing. In fact, you know, mark me down for this prediction. Today is December 28th, 2012. I'm predicting on the record, on InfoWars Nightly News, there will be a staged bombing of a government building or another staged massacre during the debate leading up to the vote on the gun control laws. It'll happen.
yeah, absolutely.
And because they need to do it to pass it.
Yeah, because popularity is kind of, they definitely would need another one to really get that bill passed.
Yep.
And in terms of, is there, that's all for the year in review. Is there any last thing you'd like to say to viewers?
Well, I'd like to say, I think 2013 is going to be the most difficult year we've ever faced, all of us, as human beings. It is a year that all of our freedoms and rights are going to be under intense assault. Not just the Second Amendment, not just the First Amendment, but in the TSA and the Fourth Amendment, and how, the roadside checkpoint searches, them conducting body cavity searches for people pulled over for speeding. We're almost in a state of war, in that the elite-minded, liberal, psychotic control freaks, they literally want to kill everyone who loves liberty. They want another mass murder. They want an Adolf Hitler type of scenario. They want to fire up the incinerators and stuff all of us into those and turn them up to high. And they might even call it green energy, because they can burn humans and they can create excess heat to power their cities, by the way. That's not a joke. There are crematoriums around the world that use the heat of burning, dead people to heat their homes. It's not a joke. But the liberals, I'm sure they would call that green energy. The more libertarians or veterans or individuals, freedom-minded individuals that they can burn in their incinerators, the greener our world becomes. Isn't it beautiful?
Yeah, the more you're supposed to like it and accept it.
You're supposed to even worship it. You're supposed to bow down before you go to bed at night and pray to the almighty Obama and pray to the collective. There is no God, they say. There is only Obama. He is our savior. And anyone who doesn't agree with that is going to be diagnosed with a mental disorder. How's that?
Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Some powerful stuff. And we encourage viewers to continue to go on naturalnews.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Good to join you today.
Well, that's all for this edition of InfoWars Nightly News. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you on Monday.